Hello class, welcome to your lecture on the life and thought of German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Like Nietzsche, Heidegger is a polarizing yet undeniably central figure to the history of Western philosophy. With the exception of the logical positivists and those who simply refuse to read Heidegger, whether due to his Nazi connections during the early 1930s or the fact that he's a complicated German philosopher whose name starts with an H, the general verdict of history is that Heidegger's Being in Time is an undeniable magnum opus of the history of Western philosophy as a whole. A book at the level of importance as Plato's collected writings, Aristotle's lecture notes, Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. For better or for worse, one simply can't do philosophy in the later 20th or 21st century, at least one can't do continental philosophy, without engaging with and attempting to reckon up an almost impossible task, Heidegger's contributions to philosophy. The most rudimentary and schematic sum up of his life might read something like this. He had a deeply conservative Catholic upbringing in southern Germany. Through his university studies, especially his reading of Franz Brentano and later Edmund Husserl, he rebelled from theology and also mathematics, which he was studying for a while, in order to pursue the, quote, atheism of thinking. But he remained throughout his life a deeply religious thinker as well. He adored poetry and art, and above all, the history of philosophy. And there are still few better ways to attempt to master the history of philosophy as a whole than to read Heidegger's voluminous Gesamtausgabe, collected writings, and then, of course, the mark against his reputation. He was a nefarious Nazi from 1933 to 1934, and never fully renounced his party membership until after the war. That topic in itself would take about 3 or 4 lectures to fully explain. There would still be, of course, more unanswered questions with the more recent appearance of Heidegger's Black Notebooks. Heidegger himself attempted to give an account of his Nazi involvement in an interview for Der Spiegel, which he stipulated was to be published posthumously, and it was. The long and short of it is that regardless of Heidegger's short-lived Nazism, he's a major Western philosopher that later history cannot help but read and attempt to understand, each person, of course, forming their own judgments on the man and the work. Enough of that for now. Let's begin at the beginning, so to speak, that is, in the lead-up to Being in Time. I also would recommend watching at this point the Eric Dodson video, Heidegger in 12 Minutes. This dense, 400-plus page work was published in 1927 under a bit of professional pressure. It was dedicated to his mentor, Edmund Husserl. The projected Part 2 and Division 3 of Part 1 of the work was never completed, although Heidegger went on to publish many works, and also many of his works were unpublished until after his death. His collected works runs to over 99 volumes. Being in Time begins with an epigraph from Plato's Sophist, in which Plato writes, "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." Heidegger asks, do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. The aim of the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being, and to do so concretely. The provisional aim is the interpretation of time as a possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. Heidegger's beginning is pretty daring here. In such a dense philosophical treatise, very much embedded in the history of Western philosophy from Plato and Aristotle through the late antique and medieval period and into the history of modern philosophy, Heidegger's beginning dares a radically original new starting point for philosophy. We have forgotten the meaning of being, and we must retrieve it. You would think that the history of philosophy, given all the illustrious figures that form it, would have given an adequate account of the concept of being. But alas, this is not the case. While the concept of being and its relation to the other fundamental concepts of philosophy was extensively discussed in Plato and Aristotle, later Western philosophy seems to have taken the concept of being more or less for granted. Heidegger's breakthrough moment is therefore devoted to formulating the question of being anew. Being was indeed investigated by ancient philosophers, then covered up, according to Heidegger, by the medieval and modern philosophical tradition. First treated by Parmenides in the 5th century BCE, being was distinguished from non-being, on from meon. For Parmenides, as you may recall from the beginning of the course, being is one and non-being is impossible. One thing seems clear from this inception of philosophical thinking in Parmenides: being is not the same as a being, that is, an entity. But what does this even mean? Very simply, it means that when you look out at the world and every particular being that exists within it, everything that exists, exists. Everything that is, including yourself as a distinctive kind of being and a distinctive individual. That you are Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am," and that beings in the world or nature are, regardless of the skeptical problem of the external world, is something that human life takes for granted more or less every day. We seldom pause to think or ask what being itself is, but prefer to take the general concept of being more or less for granted. When we ask what is the being of something, a particular thing, or anything at all in general, we seem to be asking after something transcendental, what something essentially is, independent of its empirical manifestation. We also think of being as the most universal concept. Everything that is participates in the form of being. By being the most universal, being becomes devoid of content, and this was Hegel's view. It becomes the undefinable, since there is no higher concept by which to define it. So in more or less every situation of human life, we go about our business using the terminology and the concept of being without ever thinking about it. Every predicational statement or copulous statement, such as "the sky is blue," presumes the concept of being in an unexplicated form. This is what led Kant to declare that being is not a real predicate. It's not worth thinking about, since everything that is, and that's all you need to know about the concept of being. Heidegger's intention is to overturn these philosophical and everyday prejudices. Being is not at all a clear concept, but rather the most obscure concept of all. We live in an understanding of being in this sense or that, in one way or another, but we still don't understand or are even able to formulate properly the question of what being itself means. The question of being in the philosophical tradition after Aristotle and through Hegel into the modern period is one in which the question of being is not very well formulated. So what is Heidegger doing? Well, we can start to answer that question by noticing what he's not doing. He's not searching for or trying to prove the existence of God as the medieval theologians did. God, if he exists, would be the highest being or entity, the first mover, the uncaused cause, or the being that accounts for the fact that there exists anything at all. According to Heidegger, medieval theology misunderstood the question of being in terms of an ultimate entity, more in being than any other, and the source from which the being of everything springs. Heidegger is not setting out to prove that a supreme being exists, rather, he wants to know what being itself is. Re-envisioning the starting point of Descartes from the cogito, or "I think, therefore I am," Heidegger looks to the human being, or what he calls Dasein. Dasein is a German construction that means existence. Da, there, being. As human beings, we have a tendency to pre-understand ourselves as beings of a particular sort. Traditionally, the human being is a soul in a body, maybe a bundle of impressions or ideas, memories and projects. We're still not really sure what the human being is. But one thing seems indubitable and certain. It is not "I think, therefore I am" for Heidegger, but it is that the types of beings we are, as Dasein, are beings in the world. Heidegger thus undoes the starting point of Descartes. The human being is not a thinking subject over and against an object, or an inner life over and against the external world, but the human being is an existence thoroughly enmeshed in its world. Dasein, or human existence, as we all know by virtue of the fact of being Dasein, is a being whose own being is questionable for it, thus a being whose potentiality is, in theory, to understand being. What is this really saying? Well, just this. Examine yourself. Existence is part of your way of being. It is not just a simple fact, you exist or you don't, but is something you're aware of, insofar as you are as Dasein, or their being. You might say insofar as you're conscious, but that would be to import a specific concept of consciousness or awareness. Heidegger's starting point doesn't even presume that. You are a being that is there to yourself and to the world. That much, like Descartes, is constant and secure. Are you not therefore a being that understands or pre-understands being in some sense? If I ask you, however, what the meaning of being itself is, You become, like Plato in the epigraph, to being in time perplexed. It's like asking you what the meaning of life is, but even more intense. What is the meaning of being? What is being itself? How are you to formulate the question of being itself, given that you are only a particular being who pre-understands being in some sense, at least insofar as you exist and are there in the world? Heidegger thus defines existence, inaugurating the tradition of existentialism as the human being's standing out into being in its question-worthiness. In Section 2 of Being in Time, Heidegger further pursues the formal structure of the question of being. In terms of Plato's knower's paradox in the Meno, how can you search for the meaning of being when you don't know it unless you already know it? This is not a reversion to innate ideas, but rather Heidegger's setting of guardrails to the investigation or inquiry into the question of the meaning of being. Obviously, this question cannot be posed unless we already have some knowledge of being to begin with, but our understanding of being, in the everyday sense, is average and vague. It reverts to philosophical conceptions about the concept of being, rather than engaging in the phenomenological journey that would be implied by raising the question of the meaning of being anew. Shouldn't science be able to answer this question of the meaning of being? Well, not exactly, because for Heidegger, science is constantly moving around in beings, in entities, in the world, in observations and in theories. That is what he calls the ontic. When it comes to the fundamental concepts of philosophy, the position of science is in fact relatively unstable. Fundamental philosophical renovations in the basic concepts that pattern all reality, especially the concept of being, is untestable in science and therefore an unstable ground on which to rest its hypotheses. If we're going to gain any clarification at all about the concept of being, the entity to be investigated is not out there in the world, but it is ourselves, Dasein. And so Heidegger speaks of the priority of Dasein in regards to the question of being. Remember that thing you understood from a moment ago? That you are in fact a being who understands being in some sense? Heidegger calls this Dasein's ontic, existent distinctiveness, and sees it as the basis of the ontological priority of Dasein in formulating the question of being. Your existence as Dasein is already that of a questioner of being. You are always already pre-ontological. And Dasein is thus the primary being to be interrogated. Sounds scary, but Heidegger just means inquired into, if our goal is to formulate the question of the meaning of being. For the most part, Dasein's being, however, is what Heidegger calls existentiel. That is, it exists in terms of possibilities of being itself or not being itself. Dasein has already chosen these possibilities, stumbled into them, and in each instance grown up in them. How to transition from our ordinary, everyday way of being, existentiel, into the being that can realize the possibility of raising the question of being is an unanswered question. We come to terms with the question of existence always only through existence itself, and Heidegger calls this kind of understanding of oneself existential understanding. Can we really break through the muck and understand existence itself or attain existentiality? Must first inquire extensively into the type of being that we are and our way of being, that is, the structures of our existence. Only then might we be able to see if we are the types of beings who can raise the question of being or not. A bit like psychoanalysis, but really quite different, Heidegger thus speaks of an existential analytic of Dasein. And here you see the map of the basic concepts across Heidegger's 400-page work, Being in Time. We begin from being there, or Dasein, the type of being that we essentially are. We realize we are beings in the world. Being in the world is existentially structured in terms of being in the world, disclosing the world, clearing it, and also our understanding of the worldhood of the world. That is, all the things we use every day without thinking about it, and all the things that appear to us in their presence. Dasein's being in the world is always defined for Heidegger by understanding, by state of mind or mood, and by others or the they. We experience the world factically, which for Heidegger means as given in various experiences. Our being in, our disclosure of the world, and of the worldhood of the world is always defined for Heidegger by three structures. We project the world, we are thrown into the world, and we fall into the understandings of the world determined by these structures. This leads us to our understanding, to our state of mind or mood, and also to being in the world with others. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little bit of anxiety and the feeling of uncanniness in trying to sum up Division 1 of being in time in a handy chart. For Heidegger, Angst or Unheimlichkeit, anxiety or uncanniness, are in fact fundamental existential structures that reveal to us the limitations of our understanding, the fluctuations of our state of mind or mood, and the imposition of the world and opinions of others, of the they, das Man. Anxiety or uncanniness is itself a fundamental existential structure of the types of beings that we are. Remember Kierkegaard? But what anxiety reveals to us for Heidegger is that we are constituted in our very existence by care. That is, a being always already in the world, that is ahead of itself, striving for its potentiality to be a whole, and alongside entities taken into care. Care or Sorge is for Heidegger the most fundamental existential meaning or definition of the types of beings we are. When we attempt to realize the being of ourselves as care, we transition from inauthenticity to what Heidegger calls authenticity, and in the structure of Heidegger's treatise, from Division 1 to Division 2 of being in time. Being in the world as the care structure and its authentic potentiality for being whole thrusts us into a world in which death, guilt, conscience, resoluteness pave the way towards our existential authenticity. Ultimately, for Heidegger, what Dasein is, as being in the world, is a being of time and history. Each and every one of us is constituted by a past or having been that impinges upon our present and opens it up to the future. Remember the beginning of Being in Time, where Heidegger wrote that time is the horizon for any possible understanding of being in general? Dasein is time in the form of a temporalizing historical process. And it is this temporality or context for the meaning of being which makes each of our existences a window and an open project. When Dasein can figure out how to temporalize itself authentic, only then will the question concerning the meaning of being be able to be posed. Being in time as a whole can be understood as a great opening or re-beginning of the question of being forgotten and buried since the ontologies of Plato and Aristotle. Its demands on the reader are intense, to say the least, but very much worth it. What if Heidegger were right that we have forgotten the meaning of being and were capable of retrieving it in some sense? Unfortunately, Being in Time does not come to a clear conclusion. In a way, it is the greatest veiled treatise of all time. Not that you would expect the meaning of being to be something that we could arrive at and then be able to say, yes, I got the answer. That would be a little absurd, like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy conclusion that the meaning of life is 42. The path of the thinking laid out in Being in Time is a way, not an end. What it opens up is the existential structures in which we live. And it is in this sense that Heidegger is the indisputable origin of modern existentialism. If that was all a little bit too abstract for everyone to have a firm grasp on, no worries. That's why I've included in the course pack another way of approaching Heidegger. That is the first lecture from a lecture series he delivered a few years later, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. Remember that term metaphysics from earlier in the course, the study of the nature of reality? Well, the term means much the same in Heidegger, but with a little spin. Metaphysical inquiry indeed looks into the being of beings. It begins in the pre-Socratics with the study of the being of nature, or physis, and with Plato shifts its emphasis to what goes beyond nature, i.e. to what grounds the natural world, the world of the ideas or forms. Plato doesn't put it this way, but the tradition which follows does. The ideas are later said to be metaphysica, that which go beyond the physics, and further, physics is explained by reference to the ideas. But the term itself, metaphysics, only gets going after certain lectures of Aristotle, which are titled not by Aristotle, but by his students as the Metaphysica, that is, the lectures which come after the physics. For Heidegger, following the pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle, philosophy begins as metaphysics, that is, an inquiry into the being of beings, the study of the empirical world, or what Aristotle called second philosophy, and into the structures of being itself, what Aristotle called first philosophy. The Aristotelian system indeed subtends the entire history of Western metaphysics after Aristotle and through to the empiricists, rationalists, and Kant. Thus you can see in the rationalist and empiricist traditions glimmers of Aristotle's distinction of first and second philosophy, the study of the categorical structures of being itself, being privileged by the rationalist, and the study of the being of beings in the world or nature, being privileged by the empiricist. Both Kant and Hegel attempt to reconcile these divisions, to renew metaphysics either with Kant within its proper limits, or in Hegel as a more robust project that attempts to transcend in conceptual clarity even Aristotle. For Heidegger, what this entire tradition misses is how to formulate the question of being itself, which underlines both a priori structures and the metaphysical being of beings in the empirical world. Heidegger is thus returning not to what Platonic or Aristotelian metaphysics has been taken to be by later traditions and inheritors, but rather to unanswered questions regarding being itself in Plato and Aristotle. For Heidegger, the term metaphysics itself already bespeaks our forgetting of the question of being. Although the analyses which flow from the history of metaphysics do reveal transcendental and empirical truths, the task for Heidegger in this introductory lecture will be to resituate the term metaphysics in terms of its deeper existential roots. We must destructure or deconstruct the findings of the history of metaphysics if we are to recover the grounding questions of philosophy. Heidegger thus begins, how do things stand with philosophy as metaphysics today? It has long been known that in philosophy, and especially in metaphysics, everything is uncertain, that innumerable different views, standpoints, and schools conflict with one another and begin to fray at the edges, a questionable back and forth of opinions as against the clear truths and advances, the so-called secure results of the sciences. Maybe we will know what philosophy is when we finally succeed in making philosophy a secure science? Alas, no, this has been attempted over and again throughout the course of the history of philosophy. Must we then concur that philosophy has not yet reached the maturity of a science and moves on an inferior level? The answer to this, too, for Heidegger is negative. All the talk of philosophy as an absolute science is most likely a delusion, a misunderstanding of the tasks, methods, and goals of philosophy. So what if philosophy in general and fundamentally is not science? Then what is it doing? And what is it doing in the sphere of the sciences at the university? When philosophy gives up its title to be the absolute science, does it not then become a mere proclamation of worldview? Is philosophy then not some great marketplace for ideologies? To determine that not being a science, philosophy must therefore be a marketable worldview misses the essence of philosophy. We must learn to determine philosophy from out of itself and as itself. Nor is the essence of philosophy determinable via a detour with art and religion. Philosophy for Heidegger, in its essence, is equal in stature and importance with art and religion. It does not supersede these other fields as it does in Hegel. But equality does not mean identity. Philosophy cannot be grasped by way of comparison with science, art, religion, or worldview. We must look philosophy itself in the face. Neither finally can the essence of philosophy be ascertained by way of a historical detour. To be sure, philosophy always has a history, historical contexts, and therefore a historicity in the genesis and extension of its concepts. And the very term metaphysics has a very rich and strange history indeed. But even a thorough survey of the history of philosophy or the meaning of metaphysics within it will not be decisive in our attempt to grasp the method, origin, goal, and possibility of philosophy. Any attempt to grasp philosophy directly ends up in tautology. Philosophy is thinking, philosophizing. This seems trivial, but is it trivial? Philosophy is a human activity, but what is the human being? What is Dasein? Being and time had moved in a hermeneutic circle between Dasein's pre-understanding of being and the working out of the existential analytic of Dasein. Heidegger's definition of philosophy as well moves in a circle. We can only know what philosophy is through philosophizing. Oh, it is an activity of Dasein or humanity, but we still don't know what the human being is. Heidegger thus asks in a beautifully poetic series of leading questions, what is man? The crown of creation or a wayward path, some great misunderstanding and abyss? If we know so little about man, how can our essence not be alien to us? How can philosophizing as a human activity fail to conceal itself from us in the obscurity of its essence? So you want to know what the human being or Dasein is and what philosophy is? Well, strap in and get ready for a wild ride. Do you know what you're letting yourself in for here? Nietzsche's definition of philosophy as untimely questioning, which Heidegger treats a bit later, philosophy tends to have no direct resonance with its time, yet it can be the harmony and a prelude of a time to come. Philosophy is an autonomous and often useless creative possibility. It doesn't build culture, but it gives a measure to its time. It's also constantly misinterpreted. Philosophy as untimely questioning is extraordinary questioning. Nietzsche once said, a philosopher, that is a human being who constantly experiences, sees, hears, suspects, hopes, dreams extraordinary things. For Heidegger, philosophy is extraordinary questioning concerning what is extraordinary. It is completely voluntary, fully, and especially based on the mysterious ground of human freedom. Having just left us hanging with a circular definition of philosophy as philosophizing, Heidegger quickly pivots to give us something more substantive. Philosophy, that is, an ultimate pronouncement and interlocution on the part of the human being that permeates him in his entirety. As we all know, philosophy is concerned with ultimate things. When such things are pronounced upon within the conversation of human beings and their wholeness, temporality and history in such a way that these pronouncements permeate them, then we can say that philosophy has taken place. Even here we are left wondering and wanting. We still don't know what the human being is, such that in its existence and its essence, this mysterious activity, philosophy, occurs. What are human beings when they philosophize? Did they just stumble into the universe and into the activity of philosophizing by chance? The German romantic poet-thinker Friedrich von Hardenberg on one occasion says in a fragment, philosophy is really homesickness, Heimweh, the urge to find a home, Heimat, everywhere. Philosophy emerges as a human activity because human existence is liminal, ambiguous, enigmatic, uncanny, and not at all the master of its own ground and being. Philosophize means to elucidate, to explain, to rediscover ourselves at once and at all times within the whole, that is, within beings as such as a whole, nature as well as being. We do not, however, understand the meaning of being or even how to formulate the question properly, and therefore are in the world, restless and underway, but towards where and what? Although the fundamental question of metaphysics may have been taken to be what is. Quid estin, the essence or nature of categorical structures as well as objects in the material world? In fact, this metaphysical project is driven by three even more primordial metaphysical concepts: world, finitude, and solitude. We are worldly temporal beings, open in our comportments to beings and to being. We are never the totality of ourselves or anything, since we exist in time, nor are we the totality of the world, since we are in the world. Heidegger calls this in-betweenness of human existence finitude or mortality. Finitude is furthermore always a becoming finite, that is, limitation in time and history, or the individuation of human beings with respect to their being or Dasein. Individuation does not puff the ego or the human subject up over and against the world, but isolates it into a solitude. So Heidegger here claims that world, finitude, and individuation are exemplary metaphysical concepts, that is, fundamental concepts for all philosophical thinking. For science, the world is the existent, beings as a whole or nature. For science, finitude is the quality of being bounded or limited in time. For science, individuation is a process of scission or separation, whereby an individual distinct entity is separated from a background context of emergence. This is all well and good, but for Heidegger, our deeper existential experience of world, finitude, and solitude cannot be captured in a conceptual definition, but is part of the basic phenomena of our attunement, mood, or Stimmung. When we think philosophically, we are enabling our Dasein to be gripped by an existential horizon, and thus awakened within an attunement. World, finitude, and individuation are not just external states of affairs out there somewhere, but they are existential realities for Dasein, bound up with all the grounding attunements of which a human being is capable. It is from the metaphysical realities of world finitude and individuation that humans come to experience homesickness as a yearning for belonging, or anxiety before the possibility of their own impossibility, that is death, and also profound boredom as a tarrying empty time, or festive joy as their affirmative engagement with temporal historical horizons. Having laid this all out, still a bit schematically, the lecture course which follows is over 300 pages. That's about as many as Heidegger thinks he needs to explain all this in detail. He returns to the question of what is the human being, what is Dasein, and confesses, certainly we have found no answer to this. On the contrary, the human being has become more enigmatic for us. So we ask anew, what is the human being? A transition, a direction, a storm sweeping over the planet, a recurrence or a vexation for the gods? We don't know, yet we have seen that in the essence of this mysterious being, philosophy happens. Transition, human beings are always between an earlier existence as a later one. As direction, human beings guide and orient their own history and the history of those around them. As a storm sweeping over the planet, human beings are not at all in control of their essence and existence. They repeat all the same patterns and thus become vexations for the world they open up. The rest of this lecture course, which is as good a place as any for those interested in doing a more careful and thorough reading of Heidegger, involves first an extended discussion of the meaning and history of the word metaphysics, next a 120-page phenomenological analysis of the fundamental attunement of profound boredom, and 3 complex analyses of comparative biology, departing from the work of Jacob von Uexküll and exploring 3 theses. The stone is worldless, the animal is poor in world, and the human being is world-forming. The last reading we're looking at in Heidegger this week is a much later text called the Memorial Address. Any students tempted to think that any of Heidegger's statements are a mere play on words, with little or no relevance to the role that philosophy can and should play in the contemporary world, is invited to start here and read this address above all. For Heidegger, our fundamental existential problem is that rather than learn to think, especially to think about the kinds of beings that we are in a perpetual flight from thinking. To be sure, research in all fields has never been in such a heyday, carried on with passion and ingenuity, and yet we still are without answers to the fundamental questions of philosophy. Thoughtlessness is that uncanny visitor who comes and goes everywhere in today's world. And this is because we are guided far more by calculative rather than meditative thinking. Calculative thinking computes. It computes ever new, ever more promising, and at the same time more economical possibilities. It moves from one prospect to the next, never stopping, never collecting itself. It is also in the grips of hourly radio and television, or nowadays Facebook and other social media updates. It carries on its customary course with little to no thought for our contemporary existential rootlessness, the fact that we are in danger of losing and destroying our common home. Science, buttressed by technological developments, has an answer to everything and presents itself as the road to a happier human life. Human beings acquiescing to a conception of nature that sees it as a giant gasoline station, an energy source for modern technology and industry. As the American chemist Stanley says, the hour is near when life will be placed in the hands of the chemist, who will be able to synthesize, split, and change living substance at will. In Heidegger, we take notice of and marvel at such statements and the daring of scientific research without much thinking about the consequences. The world is becoming entirely technical. It's not even what is really uncanny. Far more uncanny is our being unprepared for this transformation, our inability to confront meditatively what is really dawning in the coming age. Could the ground and foundation for a new rootedness, autochthony, wherein human beings become the meaning of the earth prophesied by Nietzsche, really look like? For Heidegger, it looks nothing like the Overman, or even an acceptance or celebration of Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. Rather, it involves a return of human beings to philosophy, to meditative thinking, which demands that we never cling one-sidedly to a single idea, nor run down a one-track course of ideas. Rather, meditative thinking demands of us that we engage ourselves with what at first sight does not go together at all. Heidegger is not anti-technology or anti-modernity, noting that we depend on our technical devices and they even challenge us to greater advances. We can affirm the unavoidable use of technical devices and also deny them the right to dominate us, and so to warp, confuse, and lay waste to our nature. This Heidegger calls the meditative releasement or Gelassenheit towards things. Releasement towards things and openness to the mystery belong together, granting us the possibility of dwelling in the world in a totally different way, but we can stand and endure in the world of technology without being imperiled by it. The alternative is the headlong plunge into the annihilation of humanity and the planet. Heidegger's philosophical project can be defined as a whole as trying to guide us into new grounds and foundations for our very being, grounds in which creativity can take root and produce lasting works. In the words of Johann Peter Hebel, human beings are plants which, whether we like to admit it to ourselves or not, must with our roots rise out of the earth in order to bloom in the ether and bear fruit. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to your introduction to Heidegger, and I look forward to reading your remarks on the memorial address. See you next week.